The first time I heard the engine start on its own, the entire crew swore I was imagining it, but I wasn't. On the North Sea oil rig, machines sometimes wake up without anyone touching them, and when they do, you better know the rules. There are exactly 11, each carved into a rusted metal plate in the mechanic's cabin, and following them is the only reason I'm still alive to tell this story. I remember the first time I broke one. I still can't forget what climbed out of the machinery that night. I'll tell you what happened, but first you need to hear the rules. When I first arrived on the North Sea rig, the foreman pulled me aside and made me read the list bolted to the wall in the mechanic's cabin. 11 lines of rust-streaked steel, with warnings carved deep enough to outlast storms. The first was the one that sank into me the most. Rule 1, never touch a machine that starts moving on its own. At the time, it sounded like nothing more than a bad joke, the sort of superstition workers pass around to scare the new guy. But when I heard the pipes shudder and twist without any hand on the valves, I started to wonder how much of it was superstition and how much was survival. The rig had its own language, a deep belly of iron and oil that never stopped groaning. Every shift I could hear chains rattle when no one stood near them, or the thump of pistons echoing through empty decks. I kept telling myself it was the ocean playing tricks, the wind carrying sound in strange ways, but the longer I stayed, the harder that lie was to swallow. Men who worked here for years didn't joke about those noises. They didn't even look up when I mentioned them. They just kept their eyes on their work and pretended I hadn't spoken. I spent the first week shadowing an older mechanic named Daltton. He was built like the rig itself, heavy-shouldered, stained in grease, eyes always half hidden under his cap. Daltton never raised his voice, but when something moved that shouldn't, he froze faster than anyone. One evening we were checking the pressure gauges below deck, when the wrench lying on the floor slid across the steel by itself, clattering against a ladder rung. I flinched and reached for it instinctively, but Dalton's hand shot out and clamped my wrist. He whispered, almost like a prayer, not if you want to keep working here." The days bled together in gray skies and salt spray, but I kept circling back to that first rule. Machines on the rig were unpredictable, even when we thought we knew them. Sometimes a gear would start spinning even with the power off, or a valve would twist against the flow of pressure. Nobody fixed it, nobody shut it down. They just waited until it stopped. That went against everything I had ever been taught as a mechanic. But when I asked why, Dalton gave me the kind of look you only give someone standing at the edge of a cliff. "You'll see," he muttered, and I hated how certain he sounded. The first real test came on a night when the sea was restless. The whole platform rocked under swells that made the steel groan. I was on shift alone in the pump chamber, listening to the rhythmic thud of machinery, when one of the pumps jerked to life without warning. The console was dark, no power flowing, but the massive pistons began to slam like a beating heart. I froze, my fingers inches from the lever I should have pulled. Every instinct screamed to shut it down before it blew, but Dalton's warning echoed in my head. I stepped back and kept my hands at my sides, though my pulse hammered so hard I thought my chest might burst. I watched as the pump hammered faster, water spraying in silver arcs under the low light. For a few seconds I thought it might rip itself apart, but then the rhythm changed. It wasn't mechanical anymore. The thudding slowed, became deliberate, almost like footsteps echoing in the chamber. I gripped the railing, fighting the urge to run, and then the pistons stopped dead. So suddenly the silence hurt my ears. The console lights flickered once, though no one had touched the controls, and then the room was still again. I could barely breathe. When I reported it to Dalton, his face tightened. "You did nothing?" he asked. I told him I hadn't touched a thing, and for the first time since I met him, he looked almost relieved. "Good," he said. "If you'd tried to fix it, you wouldn't be here now." I wanted to laugh, to brush it off as more superstition, but his voice shook just enough to convince me he wasn't exaggerating. He wouldn't tell me more, no matter how many times I pressed, only repeating that the first rule wasn't optional. I lay awake that night, listening to the wind slam against the rig, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't listened. The weeks went on, and I started noticing more incidents that didn't sit right. A crane hook swaying in still air, a set of bolts slowly tightening themselves into a plate, a valve hissing as if turned by invisible hands. The others treated it as background noise, the same way they treated the constant moaning of the ocean below us. But I couldn't. My eyes followed every unnatural twitch, every movement that defied reason, and the more I noticed, the harder it was to convince myself this was just faulty machinery. Something was watching us through those machines, and I couldn't shake the feeling it wanted us to touch back. One evening after dinner, I went back down to check the compressors. The room smelled of brine and oil, the kind of stench that seeped into your clothes. I moved through the shadows with my flashlight, beams glinting off wet steel, when I heard a low grinding. A gear assembly on the far side of the room had begun to spin slowly, though the whole line was offline for maintenance. My hand twitched toward my wrench, but I froze mid-step. Dalton's voice ran through my head again, firm and final, never touch. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching the gears grind faster and faster until sparks flew, and then, just like before, they stopped dead. This time, though, it didn't end with silence. From the far side of the machine, something shifted, the shadows bent strangely, and I could swear I saw a shape leaning out, tall and thin, like the silhouette of a man pressed through steel. My breath caught in my throat, the light flickered, and when it steadied again, the shadow was gone. The gear assembly was perfectly still, not a mark on it. I staggered back and nearly tripped over my own boots, heart racing so loud it drowned the ocean outside. That was the moment I stopped doubting Dalton. The rules weren't superstition, they were warnings. I didn't tell anyone what I saw that night. If I had, they would have told me to stop letting the sea get into my head, or worse, they would have gone quiet the way they always did. But I started carrying that fear with me everywhere. Every time a machine stirred on its own, I imagined that silhouette waiting just out of sight, pressing against the metal, waiting for me to touch it so it could step through. And every time I forced myself to back away, no matter how hard instinct screamed to act. The first rule wasn't just about safety, it was about keeping whatever was inside those machines from crossing over. Still, curiosity gnawed at me. I wanted to know what the others had seen, what experiences had burned those rules so deep into them that they never broke them. One night I cornered Dalton in the mess and demanded he tell me. He studied me for a long time, then leaned close so no one else could hear. The last man who touched one of those machines didn't last a minute, he whispered. We heard the scream, but by the time we got there, there was nothing left of him but his boots. He pulled away before I could ask more, leaving me cold and shaking. After that, I began to notice the boots. They were old, cracked, and they sat on a shelf in the back of the mechanic's cabin. No one ever moved them. I never asked again, because I didn't want the answer. But one night, when I passed by that shelf, I swore I saw salt water dripping from the empty boots onto the steel floor, spreading slowly like a tide. I told myself I imagined it, I had to. And yet, only a few nights later, something happened that made me question whether I'd be able to follow the rules forever. I was alone again, the ocean howling outside, when I heard a slow metallic grinding begin directly behind me. The sound was unmistakable. Something massive was stirring in the darkness. I turned with my flashlight, and the beam landed on the biggest machine in the chamber. Its gears were twisting by themselves, faster and faster, until sparks filled the air. And then I saw movement behind the sparks, something stepping forward from inside the steel. The sparks danced like fireflies, lighting up the chamber in harsh bursts of orange. For a moment I thought the machine would explode, but then the grinding slowed, replaced by something far worse. It was faint at first, buried under the hum of the rig, but as I held my breath, I heard it clearly. Slow, wet inhalations echoing from within the steel. That was when I remembered Rule 2. If you hear breathing from inside the machinery, leave the room immediately. My pulse spiked, and every nerve in my body screamed to get out before I even understood why. I stumbled backward, the beam of my flashlight shaking across pipes slick with condensation. The sound grew louder, no longer faint, but steady and deliberate. It didn't sound mechanical. It sounded human, too human, as though someone was trapped inside the gears, lungs straining against the metal walls. The rational part of me wanted to check, to pull the lever and shut everything down, but instinct had already taken over. I turned for the exit, boots pounding on the steel grating, and I swore the breathing followed me, growing heavier the closer I got to the door. When I burst out into the corridor, I slammed the hatch shut behind me and leaned against it, chest heaving. The breathing stopped the moment the steel sealed, leaving only the endless wind of the North Sea howling outside. I wanted to believe it was in my head, that stress was twisting the sounds into something they weren't, but I knew better. I had heard the rules, and now I understood them. Machines on the rig weren't just steel and oil. They were shells for something else, something that mimicked us in the most unsettling ways. The next morning, I told Dalton what had happened. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw fear flicker in his face. "You got lucky," he said. "Some men freeze when they hear it. They try to find the source, and that's when it notices them." I pressed him for details, but he only shook his head. "You don't want to know what it looks like when it notices." The way he said it made me shiver, because it meant he had seen it himself. Whatever had taken the last man's body hadn't just left boots behind, it had left scars on those who witnessed it. That night, sleep refused to come. Every creak of the rig, every gust of wind rattling through the pipes, reminded me of that breathing. I kept imagining lungs pressing against steel, straining to expand inside tight compartments, dragging air through rusted pipes like throats. I told myself it was impossible, that no one could survive trapped inside machinery, but the rules weren't about survival. They were about something else entirely. And the worst part was, I was starting to believe that machinery on this rig wasn't empty. It was occupied. The next few days, I avoided working alone, shadowing Dalton even when he didn't ask me to. He noticed, of course, and though he never told me to leave, he seemed more agitated than usual. The machines acted stranger too. Tools vanished and reappeared in places no one left them. Gauges ticked in impossible rhythms. Once I swore I saw a smear of condensation forming words on a pipe before it faded too quickly for me to read. I wanted to ask Dalton about it, but I was afraid he'd tell me it was normal, and that would have been worse than denial. One evening, while inspecting the main generator, I froze as the familiar sound filled the chamber again. The slow, wet inhalation rolled through the air, rising from the massive engine as though it had grown lungs. Dalton didn't hesitate. He dropped his wrench, grabbed my arm, and dragged me toward the hatch. My instincts screamed to follow him, but something in me resisted, a terrible curiosity that rooted my feet to the floor. For a heartbeat too long, I turned my head toward the generator, and in the glow of warning lights, I thought I saw the surface of the steel ripple outward, as if a chest was expanding behind it. Dalton yanked me hard enough to wrench my shoulder, and suddenly we were in the corridor again, hatch sealed behind us. His face was pale beneath the grease. "Don't you ever stop to look when you hear that," he snapped, voice raw with fury. "That's how it learns your face." His words sank into me like ice. The idea that something inside those machines could recognize me, could be waiting for me specifically the next time, was a fear I hadn't prepared for. That night, I barely blinked, staring at the walls of my cabin, listening for sounds I prayed wouldn't come. But the sounds did come. 2 nights later, when I thought I was alone in the sleeping quarters, I awoke to the faint rhythm of breathing, not from the walls this time, but from the bunk below mine. My roommate had been transferred off the rig weeks ago, leaving his bed empty. The sound was soft, steady, unmistakable. I didn't look. I didn't breathe. I slid from my mattress as quietly as I could and backed out into the hallway, never taking my eyes off the dark outline of the bunk. The moment the door closed behind me, the sound cut off, leaving me in a silence that felt heavier than noise. I wanted to believe the rules only applied to the machinery and the work decks, not the crew's quarters, but that night proved otherwise. Whatever was in the rig could move, could follow, and could find new places to breathe. The thought of it lurking beneath my bed made me want to tear the entire structure apart and throw it into the sea. Instead, I moved my things to an unused storage cabin, a cramped, freezing space that smelled of salt and dust. It wasn't much, but at least it didn't breathe when I closed my eyes. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. I began hearing phantom breaths in places where I knew there were none. Sometimes it was in the stairwells, faint and echoing. Sometimes it was in the mess hall, blending with the chatter of the crew until I realized it wasn't coming from any of their mouths. Once, when I was on deck during a storm, I swore I heard the wind itself inhale deeply, like the entire ocean was drawing breath before exhaling through the machines below. The rules weren't about one location, they were about the entire rig, every steel plate, every pipe, every chamber filled with more than air. The incident that broke me happened in the pump room again. I was there with another mechanic, a younger guy named Harris, who had only been on the rig for a few weeks. He was cocky, always laughing off the warnings. While we worked, a familiar sound began to fill the chamber, the deep, wet inhale rising from the machines. Harris smirked and leaned closer to the console, pressing his ear to the steel like he was listening to a heartbeat. I wanted to drag him away, to scream at him, but fear glued my tongue to the roof of my mouth. He chuckled. "It's just air pressure," he said, and then the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Harris straightened, shrugged, and reached for his tools. I swear I saw the metal surface dent inward slightly, like something inside had pressed against it from the other side. Before I could warn him, the console hissed, and a plume of mist sprayed across his face. He stumbled back, coughing, eyes wide with panic, but when I tried to pull him away, the hatch behind us slammed shut on its own. The room filled with a low groan, almost like disappointment, and I realized with a shiver that Harris had broken the second rule without even knowing it. The mist clung to Harris's face as he gagged and stumbled backward, and the hatch behind us rattled like something heavy pressed against it from the outside. My first thought wasn't about helping him. It was about the words etched into that rusted plaque, Rule 3, never stay alone, in the pump room after midnight. I checked my watch with trembling hands, and the glowing numbers confirmed what I already feared. It was a few minutes past 12, and Harris and I were the only ones trapped inside. Harris cursed between coughs, wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve, but the moment he tried to speak again, his voice came out ragged, like each word was being dragged through water. I grabbed him by the arm and tried to haul him toward the hatch, but the steel didn't budge. It wasn't locked. It was simply holding, as though the rig itself had decided we weren't leaving. The air grew heavy with dampness, thick enough that I could see condensation forming on the walls in the shape of long streaks, like fingers dragging downward. We backed away from the hatch, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog, and the pumps began to stir. They didn't come to life with mechanical rhythm this time. They pulsed irregularly, in sync with Harris's ragged breathing, like the machines had found a way to mimic his failing lungs. His eyes widened, reflecting the dim red glow of the safety lights, and I could see the fear overtaking his earlier arrogance. "What the hell is happening?" he rasped, clutching at his throat. I didn't answer. What could I possibly say that wouldn't make it worse? The room smelled stronger now, saltier than the sea itself, almost metallic, as if blood had been diluted in the air. Harris stumbled toward the nearest pump, maybe thinking he could shut it down, but I grabbed him and yanked him back, remembering how close I'd come to breaking the first rule myself. He shoved me away, anger flashing through his panic. "We can't just stand here," he barked, though his voice cracked halfway through. I told him firmly that we weren't going to touch anything, that the only way out was to wait, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The lights overhead flickered, casting the room in alternating shadows that stretched unnaturally long across the floor. In one of those flickers, I thought I saw another figure standing behind Harris, tall and narrow, its outline blurred as though it was made of steam. When the light steadied, the figure was gone, but Harris shivered violently and clutched at his shoulder as though something had brushed him. I asked if he felt it, but he only shook his head, eyes darting around like a trapped animal. His coughs grew wetter, each one leaving flecks of red on his sleeve. Minutes crawled by like hours, the sound of the pump sinking closer and closer to Harris's labored breathing. I pressed my palms over my ears, but even then, I could feel the rhythm vibrating through the steel grating under my boots. Every instinct screamed that we weren't supposed to be here, that the room itself was alive after midnight, and we were intruders trespassing in something else's territory. Harris staggered toward the control console again, desperation overtaking caution, and I lunged to stop him. My hands barely brushed his shoulder before another noise froze us both, a soft exhale, not from Harris, but from the pump directly beside him. The exhale fogged the air like a living thing, spreading cold across the chamber. Harris collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest, gasping for air that no longer seemed to fill his lungs. I knelt beside him, trying to pull him upright, but the moment I touched him, I realized his skin was clammy, his veins darkening beneath the surface. It was as if the machines were siphoning his breath out of him, trading his life for their false rhythm. His eyes rolled back, and a gurgling sound escaped his throat, equal parts human and mechanical. I screamed for help, though I knew no one would hear over the storm outside. The hatch rattled once more, but refused to open, and the sound of the pump swelled into something that no longer resembled breath or rhythm. It was laughter, distorted and metallic, reverberating off every pipe and surface. Harris jerked once, then went limp in my arms. His chest no longer rose. The pumps slowed, their pulse weakening, until finally they went still. The air cleared, the fog dissolving as though it had never existed, and just like that, the hatch clicked open on its own, swinging wide into the silent corridor. I dragged Harris's body out, my arms trembling from both fear and exhaustion, and left him sprawled on the grated floor. His face looked peaceful now, but his lips were tinged blue, and his eyes were still faintly open. Daltton appeared a minute later, his boots echoing in the passage, and when he saw Harris he stopped dead, his face twisted, not with shock, but with something like resignation. "You stayed in there too long," he said quietly. I demanded to know why he hadn't warned Harris himself, why no one had explained how dangerous it truly was, but Daltton only shook his head. "Warnings don't matter if they don't listen. The rig decides who makes it through the night." They took Harris's body away before sunrise. No one spoke of him after that. His bunk was stripped, his name removed from the work roster, as though he had never existed. The crew avoided my eyes when I asked questions, but I could see the answers in their silence. This wasn't the first time someone had vanished into the rules of the rig, and it wouldn't be the last. I wanted to leave, to catch the next helicopter off the platform, but the storms had cut us off for weeks. There was no escape, not unless I wanted to swim into a sea that hungered just as much as the machines. That night, alone in my cramped storage cabin, I lay awake listening to the groans of the rig. Every shudder of the walls felt closer now, every hiss of pressure like a whisper at my ear. I couldn't stop thinking about the plaque, about the way the rules weren't written as safety guidelines, but as survival laws. 11 warnings carved into steel, each more ominous than the last, and if the third one was true, then the others had to be as well. I wasn't sure how much longer I could last before the next rule claimed another life. When I finally drifted into uneasy sleep, I dreamed of the pump room. The machines towered over me, alive and breathing, and in every shadow I saw Harris, his chest rising and falling in time with the pistons. His eyes locked on mine, lips moving soundlessly, as though he was trying to tell me something. But when I leaned closer, the machines exhaled in unison, and his body dissolved into mist. I jolted awake, my skin damp with sweat, heart racing as if I'd never left that room. The next day, Daltton avoided me. He busied himself with tasks that didn't need doing, never letting me get close enough to ask more questions. It was as if he knew what was coming next, and he wanted no part in telling me. I followed him anyway, desperate for answers, but every time I tried, his silence was heavier than words. Finally, after hours of dogging his heels, he turned and muttered one thing under his breath, too low for the others to hear. "Wait until you learn the fourth." His voice cracked as he said it, and for the first time, I saw fear win out over his usual stoicism. That was the moment I realized the rules weren't just there to protect us from the rig, they were there to protect us from what came when we broke them. And after Harris, I knew the rig wasn't finished testing us. The plaque still had 8 more warnings etched into its rusted surface, and each one was waiting for its turn. The storm had barely eased when I found myself back in the control cabin, watching the radio's dials flicker under the dim red glow of the overhead lights. Harris's death still weighed heavy in the room, though no one dared speak of it, and the silence among the crew was almost suffocating. That's when my eyes strayed once more to the plaque bolted beside the door, the one with the etched commandments of survival. My chest tightened when I read the next warning. Rule 4. Do not answer the radio between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. The words haunted me more than they should have. Radios were lifelines on the rig, our only tether to supply ships, Coast Guard, or the mainland. If something went wrong, the radio was the only way we'd have a chance of survival. And yet here was a rule, carved into steel decades ago, telling us to ignore the one thing that could save us during those hours. The more I thought about it, the more wrong it felt. Why would a call for help ever be dangerous? I sat alone with the machine that night, the others either asleep in their bunks or too unnerved to keep watch. The sea outside pounded the platform with steady rhythmic crashes, and the rig groaned under the weight of the waves. The radio sat silent for the first hour, its dials twitching only with static, but I couldn't look away. My watch ticked closer to 2 o'clock, and my nerves coiled tighter with every second. At exactly 2:07, the static sharpened. It wasn't just noise anymore, it carried cadence, like someone breathing close to the receiver. I leaned in, every muscle taut. A faint voice broke through, crackling, distorted by distance and interference. "Help us." The words stretched unnaturally, carrying a wet undertone like they were bubbling through seawater. My instinct screamed to grab the mic, to answer, but the rule thundered in my head. I sat frozen, the weight of Harris's pale face still burned into my memory. The voice repeated, clearer this time, more urgent. "Please, we're sinking. Coordinates. 46 degrees. The rest dissolved into static, but it was enough to twist my stomach. The rational part of me said storms often sank ships, that ignoring a real call could mean lives lost. But another part, the one that had seen Harris's breath stolen by the pumps, told me nothing on this rig was what it seemed. The plaque's warnings weren't safety precautions, they were commandments, and disobeying meant death. I pressed my palms hard against the table, forcing myself to stay silent. The voice on the other end grew more desperate, morphing with each plea. At first it sounded like a young man, then a child, then a woman with a shrill, trembling sob. My heart hammered as though I'd been running, sweat dampening my collar. The cries overlapped, shifting mid-sentence, twisting into voices I recognized. Harris's cough rasped from the speaker. Then my own voice whispered through the static, "Pick up, please. Don't leave me here." My blood ran cold. I shoved the chair back, the screech of metal on metal cutting through the silence. The radio squealed in response, like it sensed my movement, the dial spinning wildly before settling on a dead tone. I wanted to run, to leave the cabin, but my feet stayed planted. Something inside me whispered that if I opened the door, the voice would follow, that it wasn't inside the machine, it was already here, circling the rig, searching for someone weak enough to listen. By 2:43, the room's temperature had dropped so low I could see my breath. The radio's light dimmed, and the voice returned, now singing. A low guttural hum vibrated through the speakers, carrying no words, but echoing like a hymn from beneath the ocean. It wasn't human. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that whatever I was hearing wasn't a stranded ship or a desperate sailor. It was something far older, far hungrier, testing me, waiting for me to break the rule. When the clock struck 3 o'clock, the signal vanished instantly. The warmth returned to the room, the radio's glow steady once again. My chest sagged with relief, though my hands were still shaking. I'd made it through the hour, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. I had obeyed the rule, but I couldn't stop thinking about the others who might not have. The missing rigs, the ships that never made it to port. Maybe they hadn't been sunk by storms after all. Maybe they'd just picked up the call. The next morning, Dalton found me asleep in the chair, head slumped over the radio. He looked at me like he already knew what had happened, though neither of us spoke. His silence was an answer all its own. Later, when I passed the crew in the mess hall, their conversation stopped until I left the room. They knew I'd heard it. They knew I'd been tested. But that night, as I lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling, I wondered how many rules I could endure before my will cracked. Each one demanded silence, obedience, fear, and each one peeled something human away from me, replacing it with something harder, colder. The plaque had 7 more lines etched into its rusting steel, and the way Dalton's eyes lingered on me told me that sooner or later, the rules would strip me down until there was nothing left. I thought about Harris again, and the way his voice had slipped through the static, begging me to answer. If that wasn't him, if it was just the sea wearing his voice like a mask, then how many others had it already stolen? My eyes drifted to the porthole, where the storm clouds broke just enough for the moon to paint a pale reflection across the waves. And in that reflection, just for a moment, I thought I saw lights, not from a ship, but from below, glimmering deep in the black water like a city that shouldn't exist. And then faintly, the radio crackled again, though it wasn't anywhere near 2 a.m. By the time the 5th night came, sleep was something I only pretended to get. My body ached from work, my eyes burned and my nerves stretched thinner with each strange occurrence. I kept thinking about the metal plaque bolted to the wall, and the next commandment that caught my attention. Rule 5. Never climb the exterior ladders after midnight. The phrasing rattled around in my head all day, even when I was elbows deep in an engine. Why ladders and why after midnight? It seemed like the most arbitrary warning yet, but I already knew better than to dismiss it. The rig had ladders everywhere, steel rungs bolted to the sides of the platform, winding up and down to the catwalks, maintenance decks and sea-level landings. During the day, climbing them was just part of the job, but I realized I had never once seen anyone use them after dark. Even Dalton, who never flinched at anything, avoided them once the sun dipped beneath the horizon. It wasn't until he caught me glancing toward the eastern ladder around dusk that he muttered, "You really don't want to find out what waits out there at night." Then he walked away without another word. That night, I tried to bury myself in routine. I stayed in the mess hall late, picking at a bowl of cold stew while pretending to read through repair logs. But no matter what I did, my eyes kept drifting to the porthole. The ladders stretched down the rig's legs like skeletal spines, vanishing into the churning Black Sea. I could hear the wind dragging across the steel outside, whistling through the narrow gaps like something calling out. My gut twisted with unease, though part of me, against my will, wanted to test the rule. Maybe it was morbid curiosity. Maybe it was just the need to know why. When the clock in the mess hall hit 12, I heard it. At first I thought it was the storm again, just the sea lashing against the supports. But then I realized the sound had rhythm. It wasn't waves, it was footsteps, not heavy boots, but something lighter, faster climbing. The faint clang of rungs being gripped, one after another, in a steady, deliberate rhythm that echoed through the rig's bones. My spoon clattered against the table as I froze, straining to hear. The sound wasn't above me, it was below, rising from the very bottom of the ladder where it met the sea. I told myself not to move, but I couldn't help it. I stepped into the corridor, following the faint metallic vibration that shivered up through the walls. The closer I came to the eastern platform door, the louder it grew, until it was undeniable. Something was climbing the ladder. Every instinct screamed at me to back away, but I reached the door anyway, pressing my ear to the cold steel. The sound was right there on the other side. Whatever it was only a few rungs away from the landing. I held my breath as the footsteps stopped. For a moment silence pressed against my skull, and I thought maybe I had imagined it. Then I heard the breathing, low, ragged, wet, like lungs filled with brine. I staggered back, heart slamming against my ribs, but my eyes caught the tiny round window in the door. Against my better judgment, I looked. What I saw clinging to the ladder made my blood curdle. At first, it resembled a man, though its proportions were stretched, its arms longer than they should have been, knuckles gripping the rungs with a strength that bent the metal. Its skin was pale, swollen and slick, reflecting the thin moonlight like fish scales. Seaweed clung to its limbs, draping off like tattered rags, but it wasn't its body that terrified me most. It was the face, waterlogged, eyeless, mouth frozen open in a grin too wide, as if the ocean itself had worn down a corpse and reshaped it into something that climbed. I stumbled backward, just as the creature pressed its face to the window. It didn't knock or screech, it only grinned wider, seawater leaking down the glass, as though it had seeped straight out of its lungs. My legs carried me before I even realized I was running, boots pounding down the corridor toward the bunks. By the time I reached Daltton, panting and pale, I could barely choke out the words. He didn't ask what I saw, he only said, "That's why we don't touch the ladders after midnight. Once they know you've noticed, they'll keep trying to come higher." I barely slept at all after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the grin pressed against the glass, the water trickling down in thin streams. Worse, I swore I could still hear the rungs bending in the night, metal groaning like the thing was still climbing. Even when the sun came up, I avoided the ladders, walking the long way around the rig instead of passing near them. But deep down, I knew I hadn't escaped anything. The rule kept me alive, but it didn't erase the fact that something had seen me watching. By the following night, the crew grew tense again. Storms brewed on the horizon, the sea rising with a violence that made the rig sway and shudder. I volunteered to stay in the mess, while the others bunkered down, but really, I just wanted to keep watch on the eastern door. Midnight came, and right on cue, the climbing began again. This time, though, there was more than one. 2 sets of hands, then 3, rattling the rungs in a staggered rhythm, scraping their way upward from the sea. My throat went dry as I backed away, but the window glimmered with movement. I forced myself not to look, not to give them the satisfaction of being seen. But as I turned down the corridor, something echoed behind me that made my stomach drop. A second set of footsteps, not outside, inside. Slow, deliberate, wet. I spun around to face the door, but the window was empty. The grinning face was gone, yet the sound didn't stop. It was on the rig with me now. The night after the ladder incident, I swore I wouldn't leave the safety of the common areas, but my job had other plans. Around midnight, Dalton shook me awake, telling me the south turbine was rattling again and needed inspection before sunrise. My stomach turned as we walked down the steel corridor, the sound of the sea pounding faintly through the walls. The engine room was the last place I wanted to be, but there was no arguing with duty. As I stepped inside, the plaque's words cut into my memory. Rule 6, never stay alone in the engine room. When the lights flicker, the room was massive, a cavern of pipes, valves and pistons, all thundering in a rhythm that shook the floor beneath my boots. The air tasted metallic, heavy with oil, and the faint tang of salt water that always seemed to seep where it shouldn't. Dalton left me with a curt nod, saying he'd check the pressure on the upper deck, leaving me alone with the turbines. That's when the fluorescents above me gave a single stutter, a faint dip in their glow before stabilizing again. I froze, wrenched halfway to the bolts, and my heart drummed against my ribs. I told myself it was nothing, just old wiring reacting to the storm. But the plaque's rule wasn't written for nothing. The longer I stood there, the more the silence between each engine thrum seemed unnatural, like the whole room was holding its breath. Then the lights flickered again, this time longer, shadows leaping across the walls like twisted silhouettes. I caught movement in the corner of my eye, something tall, thin, and wrong, shifting just beyond the reach of the glow. I backed toward the main hatch, wrench gripped tight in my hand. The light steadied, and the space looked normal again, only steel and pipes staring back. But the air felt heavier, pressing on me from all sides, thick enough that each breath scraped in my throat. I should have left then, but pride, or stupidity, made me stay. I forced myself to crouch by the turbine, tightening the bolts, even though my hands trembled. The lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging the room into near darkness, and in that blackness, I heard it, breathing. Not the heavy churn of machinery, but a slow, steady inhale and exhale, right behind me. I whipped around, wrench raised, but the glow returned before I could swing. The room was empty, every corner exactly as it should be, but the air carried the sharp scent of seawater, and a trail of wet footprints led across the floor, stopping inches from where I stood. My chest seized with panic, and I bolted for the hatch, wrench clanging against the floor as I dropped it in my sprint. I slammed the door behind me, pressing my back against the cold steel as if it could keep whatever was inside from following. Dalton found me moments later, pale and sweating. He didn't ask questions, didn't need to. He only muttered, "You stayed in there too long, didn't you?" His eyes flicked toward the door, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw fear. "They like it when the lights go," he said, his voice low, "and if you're alone they notice." He walked me back to the bunks in silence, but I couldn't shake the image of those wet footprints, stopping just short of where I stood. Sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the lights flickering above my bed, shadows creeping closer until they swallowed me whole. I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion, paranoia, or maybe the trick of oil-slicked floors, but deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever lived in the dark corners of that engine room had been inches away, watching me, waiting for the bulbs to die for good. And next time, I might not have the chance to run. The following day, the crew avoided the engine room like it was cursed, each man finding some excuse to be elsewhere. But by dusk, another storm swelled across the horizon, darker and angrier than the last. The rig groaned under the first waves, lights dimming in protest as the wind howled through the beams. I sat at the mess hall table, staring at the ceiling, listening for the hum of the fluorescents. I prayed they wouldn't flicker. Then from somewhere below the power stuttered, and the entire rig plunged into blackness. When the emergency lights flickered back to life after the blackout, most of the crew gathered in the mess hall, their faces pale, eyes hollow. The storm had torn at the rig through the night, and none of us had slept. I sat slumped over my coffee, staring at the window where the horizon began to lighten. The plaque's warnings haunted me, and one line in particular rose to the surface as if it had been waiting. Rule 7, never step onto the deck during a red sky at dawn. At first it sounded like a sailor's superstition, one of those old rhymes about weather, but here on the North Sea, I had learned nothing on that plaque was superstition. Dalton stood near the window too, jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back as if bracing himself. When the first streaks of dawn broke, the sky bled crimson, streaked with bands of orange that looked less like sunrise and more like the whole world was burning. The sight was beautiful in the worst possible way, and my stomach sank. The rig always felt isolated, but in that light it looked unreal, almost staged. The waves shimmered with the same unnatural red glow, like blood swirling under the surface. I wanted to step out, to feel the sea air, and prove it was only another morning, but I stayed put. Dalton didn't look at me when he spoke, only whispered, "Stay inside, that's not for us." He left the room without another word, his boots echoing down the corridor. I told myself the others would follow his lead, that no one would be reckless enough to break a rule after what we'd already seen. But then I caught sight of Jenkins. He was one of the newer deckhands, younger than me, always with something to prove. He stood at the door to the outer platform, his hand on the latch, his face washed in the red light pouring through the window. He turned to me with a grin that didn't fit the tension in the room and said, "What's the point of being out here if we're too scared to even see the sunrise?" I pushed up from my chair, my gut twisting, but before I could reach him, he swung the door open. The red air rushed in, warm and heavy, carrying the smell of salt and rust. Jenkins stepped outside, boots clanging against the steel deck, and the door slammed behind him with a hollow clang that made me flinch. The mess hall fell silent. No one moved. We all just stared at the door, waiting. At first, nothing happened. Through the porthole, I saw Jenkins lean against the railing, arms stretched wide as if embracing the morning. He laughed, his voice muffled by the glass, and called something I couldn't hear. Then he froze, his head tilted to the side, as though he'd heard a whisper none of us could. He leaned over the railing, peering down into the glowing water, and for the first time, I noticed the waves weren't moving right. They weren't waves at all, they were shapes, rising and falling in rhythm, shimmering beneath the surface like 1,000 pale bodies waiting to climb. Jenkins shouted again, but this time his voice cracked with fear. He stumbled back from the railing, but something unseen seemed to grip his boots. His hands clawed at the air, his mouth opening in a scream I couldn't hear through the glass. Then he dropped to his knees, as if yanked downward, his body dragging across the deck toward the edge. I pounded the window, yelling for him, but my voice was drowned by the roar of the sea. The others shouted too, some rushing forward, as if to open the door, but Daltton appeared from nowhere and shoved them back with more force than I thought him capable of. "Don't," he barked, his face pale, eyes blazing. "You open that door, you'll all follow him." We froze helpless, as Jenkins' body slid over the railing and vanished into the crimson sea below. The water swallowed him instantly, leaving only ripples that shimmered like liquid fire. Silence crashed over us. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then the sea itself seemed to sigh, a deep rolling sound that vibrated through the rig's steel bones. I stumbled back into my chair, chest heaving, my mind refusing to accept what I'd seen. Daltton stood at the window, staring down at the waves, his jaw clenched tight. Finally, he whispered, "The dawn isn't for us, it's for them." He didn't say who them was, and I didn't ask. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The rest of the morning passed in eerie quiet. No one spoke of Jenkins. His bunk stayed untouched, his tools left where he had last set them. The men moved like ghosts, avoiding the windows, avoiding each other. I caught myself glancing at the horizon every few minutes, half afraid the sky would bleed red again, half afraid I'd see Jenkins standing on the water, calling us out to join him. By noon, the sea had returned to its normal gray turmoil, but the unease never left. That night, I dreamed of the dawn. In the dream, I stood on the deck, my boots sinking into the steel, as if it were sand, the red light burning my skin. The sea below boiled with pale arms reaching upward, thousands of hands stretching to pull me down. Jenkins was there too, his face bloated and grinning, his voice echoing in my head, though his mouth never moved. "It's beautiful out here," he said. "Why don't you join us?" I woke gasping, drenched in sweat, the phantom warmth of that red air still in my lungs. The next morning, I avoided the mess hall windows. I couldn't bear to see the sky, couldn't risk knowing what color it bled. The other men seemed to feel the same, moving through the rig with their eyes down, their conversations clipped. Daltton passed me in the corridor, his face drawn tighter than ever. He paused as if to say something, but only shook his head and walked on. The silence between us was louder than words. By evening, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the low moan of an approaching storm. I tried to lose myself in work, in the comfort of bolts and engines, but every clang of metal reminded me of Jenkins' boots dragging across the deck. The red dawn wasn't just a warning of weather, it was an invitation, and he had answered it. I didn't know if we'd ever see him again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if the sky bled once more, he'd be waiting just beyond the door. As night fell, I sat awake in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sea. Every groan of the rig felt heavier, every shadow in the corridor stretched longer. I told myself I'd follow the rules, no matter what. I'd obey every line etched into that plaque. But deep down, I wondered if it was already too late, because when I finally closed my eyes, I could swear I heard Jenkins' laughter echoing from the horizon, carried by the wind, promising another dawn. And this time, I wasn't sure the door would stay shut. The storm had passed by midnight, leaving the rig shrouded in a silence too heavy to feel natural. I couldn't sleep, not after what we'd seen, so I paced the narrow halls, the hum of the generators my only company. That's when I remembered another line from the plaque, carved deep, as if the metal itself wanted to scream it into memory. Rule 8, never respond to the voice that knows your name. At the time it felt like paranoia, but standing alone in the steel veins of the rig, the warning pressed harder against my chest. The first time it happened, I thought I was imagining it. I was passing the stairwell that spiraled down toward the ballast tanks, when I heard it, soft, clear, cutting through the howl of the wind. My name, not shouted, not distorted by distance, but whispered like someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting across rusted walls, but there was no one there, just the emptiness of the rig, humming in reply. I told myself it was fatigue. After all, none of us had been sleeping right since Jenkins. But then it happened again. This time from the dark of the stairwell itself. My name carried upward on a breath that didn't belong. It wasn't Dalton. It wasn't any of the men. I knew their voices. This one was softer, smoother, almost coaxing, like it wanted me to lean closer, to descend those steps into the shadows where the sea pressed hardest against the steel. I didn't move, but my body betrayed me. I felt my weight shift toward the railing, my hands trembling as though pulled by invisible strings. The sound wasn't just a voice. It was a tug, a hook in my chest reeling me down. Only when the stairwell light flickered, just once, did I stumble back, gasping, breaking whatever hold it had. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the cold steel like it could anchor me to the world. The others noticed something off about me at breakfast. They didn't ask, but I caught them glancing when I rubbed the back of my neck, when I jumped at sudden noises. Dalton sat across from me, his eyes narrowing as if he knew exactly what had happened. He didn't speak until the others had left, and then, in a low voice, he said, "You heard it, didn't you?" I wanted to deny it, but the look in his eyes stopped me cold. He leaned forward, his voice so low it was nearly swallowed by the hum of the vents. "It starts small, just your name. Then it learns how to sound like the people you trust. You answer it once, even with a whisper, and you'll never stop hearing it again." His hand clenched around his mug, knuckles white. That's how we lost Reed. He followed the voice all the way down into the maintenance shafts, never came back up. The thought of Reed, someone we'd worked beside for months, sent a shiver through me. His bunk had been stripped before I arrived. No one spoke of him, not until now. And suddenly, the silence surrounding his name made sense. That night, I lay awake in my bunk, the walls groaning with the pressure of the sea. I tried to focus on the rhythm of the generators, the comfort of their mechanical heartbeat, but when the power dipped for just a breath, the hum faltered, and in that pause I heard it again. My name. This time, it was different. It wasn't coaxing, it was pleading. The voice sounded like my sister's. She died years ago, swallowed by an accident. None of us saw coming. Hearing her call me from the dark, the exact cadence of her voice, the softness of how she used to say my name, I nearly broke. Tears burned at my eyes, and I almost answered, almost whispered back into the dark. But then Dalton's warning echoed louder. "You answer it once, you'll never stop hearing it again." I pressed my fist to my mouth until my teeth cut my skin, forcing myself to stay silent. The whisper stretched on, circling the bunk, as though searching for me in the dark. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I lay frozen until dawn, unsure if I had won or only delayed something inevitable. By morning, I thought I was safe. But when I walked the corridor to check the ballast readings, I saw wet footprints leading away from the stairwell, the same one I'd heard the voice from. The prints weren't made by boots. They were bare, long-toed, the kind of prints no man could leave. They trailed along the steel, vanishing near the mess hall door. My stomach dropped when I realized the door had been locked all night. Something had walked among us. I turned to retreat, but before I could, I heard it again. My name, only this time it wasn't behind me. It came from the mess hall, from inside, and worse, it wasn't my sister's voice anymore. It was mine. The memory of hearing my own voice calling from the mess hall still haunts me. But there wasn't time to process it before another warning rose in my mind. Stamped into the plaque, deep and sharp like the others, was Rule 9. If the sea mist enters the rig, do not breathe until it clears. At first I thought it was a metaphor, some old superstition meant to keep us from panicking during storms. But when the mist actually arrived, sliding through sealed doors like smoke with a mind of its own, I understood why the warning carried such finality. It began just after dawn, when the air outside looked heavy and pale, as though the horizon itself was dissolving. From the deck I watched a low blanket of fog roll across the waves, but unlike ordinary fog, this one moved with intent. It curled upward, licking at the steel supports like greedy hands. By the time I scrambled back inside, alarms were already buzzing, not from weather warnings but from pressure sensors. Something was leaking where nothing should. Dalton caught me in the corridor, his eyes wide, a rag tied around his face as if cloth could stop what was coming. "Don't breathe if it gets in," he snapped, shoving a second rag at me. "Hold until your chest burns if you have to. Just don't let it in." His urgency left no room for argument, and I followed him down the corridor, the hum of the generators drowned by the thudding of my own pulse. When it finally breached, there was no warning sound. No door hiss. The mist simply appeared, flowing under the frame like water, spilling into the hall where we stood. It wasn't natural vapor. It glittered faintly, as though dusted with crushed glass, and where it touched the floor, the steel hissed faintly, as though corroded by invisible acid. My throat tightened instantly, an instinctive gasp fighting its way up, but Dalton's glare froze me in place. I pressed the rag hard against my mouth, lungs aching from restraint. The mist coiled around us like a living thing, swirling, shifting, whispering without sound. In its haze I thought I saw shapes, figures pacing just beyond reach, their outlines vague but unmistakably human. They pressed their hands against the walls, peered through the fog like hunters searching for prey. One of them even tilted its head toward me, and though its face dissolved as I stared, I knew it could see me. Seconds stretched into eternities. My chest burned, muscles screaming for oxygen. Dalton motioned for me to stay still, his own lips blue at the edges as he forced himself to endure. The mist thickened, reaching tendrils toward us, brushing against the rag like it knew we were resisting. I swore I felt cold fingers graze my cheek, though no one was near enough to touch. I thought I'd break. I thought I'd inhale and end it, no matter the cost. Just as black spots crept across my vision, the mist recoiled as if pulled by some unseen tether. It seeped back beneath the door, leaving the corridor damp and stinking of brine. Only then did Dalton rip the cloth away, gasping like a drowning man breaking the surface. I collapsed against the wall, air tearing into my lungs, throat raw from denial. We didn't speak for a long time. My body shook as though I'd been frozen from the inside, and Dalton's eyes carried the hollow look of someone who had relived an old nightmare. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, nearly reverent. "It doesn't kill you fast. It changes you." Read before he was gone, we found him standing in the mist, breathing it, smiling. He turned away sharply. We had to bolt the doors behind him. I wanted to ask what happened to Reed after that, but I already knew. His absence, the silence around his name, the footprints near the mess, it all tied together now. The mist had touched him, drawn him away, left something in his place. The thought settled like lead in my stomach. The rest of the crew pretended nothing had happened, but I could see it in their movements, the way they avoided the lower corridors, the way they glanced nervously at the sealed doors when the air grew too still. That night, as I lay in my bunk, I dreamed of the mist slipping in through the vents, pressing against my chest, seeping into my lungs while I slept. I woke choking, certain I'd inhaled something I couldn't expel. When I checked the corridor, it was clear, but on the wall near the stairwell, letters had been scrawled in wet streaks, as though written by a finger dipped in seawater. My name, over and over, running down the steel. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat, because the strokes weren't fresh. They had dried into the metal itself, as though the rig had swallowed them whole. Dalton found me staring, and didn't look surprised. He only muttered, "It remembers who resisted. It waits." His words haunted me the rest of the day, heavy as the sea pressing against the rig's hull. And when night fell again, I lay awake, listening to the creak of pipes, the hum of machines, waiting for the glittering haze to return. But the mist didn't come that night. Something else did. As the lights flickered and the generator groaned, I heard wet footsteps in the hall outside my cabin, slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth as though deciding whether to stop at my door. I pressed my back to the wall, fists clenched, every nerve in me screaming that I should hide, scream, run, but I couldn't move. The footsteps paused, silence pressed against the door, thick and suffocating. Then through the crack beneath the frame, I saw a faint glitter drifting inward, not the full mist, just enough to prove it could find me anywhere. My lungs locked, my heart hammering as I fought the urge to breathe. And then something bent low, pressing its face to the gap in the door. The night after the mist tried to seep under my door, another memory from the plaque carved itself into my thoughts, one that chilled me more than the others. It read, Rule 10. Never use the emergency rafts after midnight. I had always assumed this one was a joke, some superstition scribbled by a drunk worker long gone. But when the storm broke the sea open, and the rig shuddered like it might split apart, I finally understood why no one ever dared test it. The gale arrived just past 11, the waves rising like walls of black glass, smashing against the supports with bone-rattling force. Alarms blared, klaxons howling through the corridors, and men scrambled like ants through the narrow halls. I was in the engine bay when a voice screamed over the comms, someone shouting about a breach, about water flooding the lower decks. The word evacuate cut through the noise, and for a moment instinct told me to run for the rafts. By the time I reached the main corridor, I wasn't the only one thinking it. A group of 3 men were already pounding toward the storage bay where the inflatable rafts were locked. The storm outside roared like a beast, metal groaning, lights flickering. One of the younger workers, Collins, turned back at me with wild eyes, yelling that if we didn't leave now, we'd drown with the rig. His desperation was a mirror of my own, but Dalton's warning screamed louder inside my skull. I tried to stop them, shouting that the rafts weren't safe after midnight, but they didn't listen. The clock above the mess hall showed 12:04 when they burst through the storage doors. By the time I caught up, the wind had torn the bay wide open, sea spray and rain whipping through the air. The men had already unlatched a raft, struggling to drag it across the slick floor toward the churning waves below. I stood frozen, the rule pulsing in my mind like a drumbeat. The first raft inflated in seconds, snapping taut with unnatural speed, the rubber stretching until it seemed it might burst, but it didn't. Instead it shivered, its surface rippling as though filled not with air but with something alive. Collins didn't notice. He was too busy shouting at the others to climb in. I opened my mouth to warn him, but the words caught in my throat as the raft began to move on its own, sliding across the deck toward the water. The men tried to hold it back, but the thing had strength no raft should. It dragged them to the edge like prey on a hook, their heels scraping against the steel floor. Collins cursed, gripping the tether line, and that was when the raft shuddered, convulsed, and something pushed outward from inside its rubber skin. A hand, thin, pale, pressing from within, as though trying to claw its way out. The men screamed, but their voices were drowned by the storm. I stumbled backward, watching as more shapes pressed against the raft's surface. Faces, distorted and gasping, mouths opening wide as though sucking for air. The rubber stretched, but instead of tearing, it held, trapping them just beneath the surface. Collins yanked at the tether, but the line burned through his hands, slick with blood as the raft yanked itself into the sea. The last thing I saw before it vanished into the waves was Collins' face, wide with terror as the rubber wrapped around him, pulling him inside like quicksand. His scream was cut short, muffled, swallowed. The other two men tried to run, but the second raft had already begun to inflate. It hissed like it was breathing, exhaling brine instead of air, and when its seams expanded, a spray of salt water burst from its valves, soaking the deck with the stench of rot. I fled. Dalton's hand caught my arm in the hall, yanking me back as another roar of the storm shook the rig. His face was pale, but his voice carried iron. "You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded, trembling, unable to speak. His grip tightened. "That's why we don't use them after midnight. They're not rafts anymore, they're mouths." The storm raged until dawn, leaving the rig, battered but still standing. When the sea calmed, the storage bay was empty. No rafts, no bodies, just salt-streaked floors and the faint outline of where the rubber had pressed against steel. The others whispered that the men had drowned in the waves, but Dalton and I knew better. We didn't correct them. We just let their version of the truth settle like a weak bandage over an unhealed wound. But I couldn't stop thinking about Collins, about his face pressed behind that rubber skin, mouth open in a scream that never reached the air. When I closed my eyes, I saw him floating beneath the surface of the raft, eyes glassy, hands pounding, begging to be released. I wondered if he was still down there, somewhere in the black water, carried across the North Sea in a vessel not meant for the living. That night, I dreamed I was lying inside one of those rafts, the rubber pressed tight against my chest, water dripping into my mouth, lungs filling as I struggled against the suffocating seal. I woke gasping, clutching at the sheets, certain I'd find salt on my lips, and when I glanced at the window beside my bunk, I swore I saw a faint outline against the glass. Collins' hand, fingers splayed, pressing against the pane from the outside. I stumbled back, but when I blinked, it was gone. Only the endless sea stretched beyond the glass, black and infinite. I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, just my mind, replaying horrors burned into memory. But deep down, I knew better. The rafts didn't just take bodies, they kept them, and sometimes they brought them back. The next morning, Dalton avoided my eyes. He didn't need to ask what I'd seen. Instead, he muttered, "It's getting closer to choosing. You feel it too, don't you?" I didn't answer, but the truth weighed heavy. Every rule broken left scars on the rig, and on us. The sea wasn't just outside anymore, it was finding ways in. That night, as the generator lights flickered, and the wind clawed at the walls, I heard something scraping against the outer hull. Slow, deliberate, like nails dragged across steel. I pressed my ear to the wall, heart hammering, and a faint sound carried through, muffled but unmistakable. A voice, Colin's voice, calling my name. When I first read the plaque, this one seemed the strangest of all. Rule 11. If you hear the rig breathing, do not stay until morning. At the time I laughed at it, thinking it's some poetic nonsense written to scare new hires. But after Collins vanished into the raft, and the whispers clawed through the halls, laughter was gone from me. I began to wonder if maybe the rig was more than just steel and machinery. And then one night, I found out. The air was different that evening, heavier, as though the storm clouds above pressed down on us alone. I walked the silent corridor toward the generator room when I noticed it. The rhythm, not the usual hum of machines, but a slow, deliberate draw and release. Inhale, exhale. The walls seemed to swell slightly, the pipes vibrating like lungs expanding with borrowed air. For a long moment, I froze, hand gripping the railing, my own breath caught in my throat. At first I thought my imagination was filling in patterns where none existed. But as I pressed my palm against the steel, I felt it, a pulse, steady and living, coursing through the walls beneath my skin. The rig was not just groaning under the weight of the sea, it was breathing. And if the rule was right, then staying until morning would mean none of us would leave alive. I bolted to Dalton's cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. He looked at me with hollow eyes, as if he had been waiting for this. "You heard it," he muttered. Not a question, but a statement. I nodded, shaking, unable to find words. He leaned forward, whispering like a priest giving last rites. "It only happens once. When it decides it's hungry enough, we can't wait for dawn. We have to leave before it finishes inhaling." His words sounded mad, but the memory of the breathing walls silenced my doubts. We scrambled through the corridors, gathering what little gear we could carry. The others we passed didn't ask questions. They saw the terror etched into us and followed, fear moving them faster than reason. We didn't head for the rafts, not after what we'd seen. Instead, Dalton led us toward the emergency crane, where supply barges once docked. The storm had eased, but the sea still writhed below, black and endless. The breathing grew louder as we moved. Each inhale rattled the bolts in the walls. Each exhale sent dust cascading from the ceiling. The rig shuddered as though a giant beast slumbered beneath it, tethered to our home by chains we couldn't see. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't just inside a machine anymore. We were inside something alive, and it was waking. At the crane platform, the air was so thick with salt, I could taste blood on my tongue. Dalton shouted for us to climb, but even over the roar of the sea, I heard it, a low groan, not from metal but from a throat. The rig was no longer hiding its hunger. The platform vibrated beneath my boots, as if the heartbeat of the thing below was shaking every bolt loose. One of the crew, Miller, froze. His face was pale as chalk, his body locked as though held by unseen hands. I reached for him, but then the floor beneath him sagged inward, metal bending like flesh, and in an instant, he was gone. Swallowed, the platform snapped back, leaving nothing but damp steel where he had stood. His scream echoed only once before it was muffled by the walls around us. Dalton dragged me forward, his grip iron on my arm. "Don't look back," he hissed. "If it knows you're watching, it'll take you next." We climbed the crane ladder, every rung slick with salt. Below us, the deck rippled unnaturally, as if the entire rig was shifting skin. Shapes moved beneath the steel, pressing upward, distorting the floor with outlines of arms and faces. I bit down on my tongue to keep from screaming. At the top, the wind howled, but the sky was clear. The moon glared down on us, lighting the sea in shards of silver. Dalton pointed to a rusted barge tethered far below, bobbing weakly against the waves. It wasn't much, but it was our only hope. We scrambled to release the crane cable, the metal groaning, as the hook descended toward the barge. Every second stretched as the rig's breathing grew faster, harsher, as though it was building towards something final. Just as we secured the cable, the deck below split open with a roar. Not from machinery, not from the storm, but from a cavernous maw tearing itself into existence. Rows of jagged steel teeth glistened where the floor had been, and a hot rush of air blasted upward, carrying with it the stench of decay. The rig wasn't just breathing anymore, it was opening its mouth. The others screamed, clinging to the cable, as the crane swung us out over the sea. Dalton shouted for us to hold tight, his words nearly lost in the chaos. My hands burned as the rope tore into my skin, the sea surging below, the maw of the rig yawning wider above us. For a moment I thought we had made it, that we'd escape into the night, leaving the cursed machine behind. But as the barge drew closer, I glanced up. Dalton's face was twisted in horror, his eyes locked on the rig. "It knows," he whispered, and in that instant, I realized the breathing had stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. It wasn't inhaling anymore. It was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to drag us back inside. The cable jerked violently, pulled upward by a force stronger than any storm. My grip slipped, the sea rushing up to swallow me whole. I screamed Dalton's name, but the wind tore it away. The last thing I saw before darkness swallowed me was the rig towering above, its jagged mouth closing slowly, patiently, as though it knew it had all the time in the world. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.